Vladimir Putin has had a rough couple of days. Do we feel bad for him? Not really on this channel. He's not only had one of his buddies spill his secrets, but it seems like his army might just be stuck. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about all of it. Okay, so first off, this I thought was one of the most interesting stories of the day. As we talked about in my last video, Putin has committed himself to try to spin this attack in Moscow as being somehow Ukraine affiliated. And he needs it to, right? Because the failure of his intelligence apparatus is pretty massive. And in fact, it's even a personal failure because Putin himself, the U.S. warned Putin. They said, hey, listen, we have some evidence that this group, ISIS-K, is going to launch an attack in Moscow. And Putin, right, the U.S. embassy went so far as to alert its U.S. citizens in Russia, telling them don't go near large gatherings because of the danger. And Putin, not only did he ignore those warnings, but he made a public statement to the Russian people saying that the U.S. was being needlessly provocative. And so to have the enemy, the U.S. and NATO actually warn you about this grave threat to your country, and then to publicly not just ignore it, but berate them for doing so, is pretty embarrassing for Putin. However, Putin is desperate to try to link this event with the Ukraine war, to attempt to demonize Ukraine and use it as an excuse to further mobilize the country in the face of increasingly difficult battlefield conditions for Russia. Now, there's just a little problem for old Vladdy Daddy, and that is that the ISIS-K folks have no affiliation with Ukraine. That's the problem. But don't worry, the Kremlin spin machine always finds a way. And so what they've been spinning is that the attackers fled Moscow and appeared to be going in kind of a southwesterly direction. Let me pull up a map here and I'll show you guys where they allegedly went. So let's see if we can do this here. Okay, so I can do one better. I can show you literal, I think the literal destination they were heading to. Okay, so it looks like here's where they ended up getting apprehended. Okay, and bada boom. Okay, so check this out, right? So here is Moscow where the attack was perpetrated, and here's where they were detained. It was actually along this route en route to Bryansk. And as you guys can see, what's interesting about this area is that it's not really totally clear where they're headed, right? And the Kremlin has said that actually they were going to Ukraine because they were sure that the Ukrainians would let them through the border. And this has been central to the Kremlin's narrative that they've attempted to spin, where they said, listen, these attackers had some level of help from Ukraine. Now, what they haven't produced is evidence, right? There's no text messages, there's no communication, there's no satellite photos of Ukraine opening the border or whatever. And in fact, in some ways, while there's no good options, right? Shocker. Says it's not a great idea to attack civilians. There's really only bad ones, right? Because remember, especially following the Ukrainian raids in Belgorod, the border here is actually pretty militarized. So the attackers, if they were going to Ukraine, would have to pass through a pretty large Russian military contingent, right? But the alternative, of course, is Belarus, an ally of Russia, where they really wouldn't have much in the way of political protection. So these guys probably just running to run. But where things get interesting is that the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, classic, putting his foot in his mouth, exposed the fact that actually the attackers were probably planning to escape to Belarus, right? They were trying to get to Bryansk Oblast and then to Belarus. And he said, of course, that Belarus introduced a heightened security regime following the attacks, and that the attackers had to change course towards the Russia-Ukraine border, right? Lukashenko actually said the attackers, quote, couldn't enter Belarus, unquote, and praised the high levels of cooperation between the Russian and Belarusian special services for leading to the attackers' arrest, and suggested, so this suggestion that the attackers were actually going to Belarus before the Belarusian and Russian special services contradicts the central Kremlin narrative that this was a Ukraine-linked event. Instead, this route they took, and this is an approximation, right? You can see I just plugged into Google Maps. But this approximation of their route is not even necessarily indicative of where they were headed. And the fact is that roadblocks and checks of various sorts forced them to turn and take different routes and go towards Ukraine when they were planning on going to Belarus is a huge revelation. It means that the Kremlin narrative that we kind of knew was BS at the beginning, right? That the attackers never even intended to flee to Ukraine. Even if they didn't make any coordination, that wasn't even their plan. And so Putin, again, is stuck having to deal with reality, right? His narrative framework just cannot hold against the reality of the situation. And this is pretty preposterous, right? And it's a pretty embarrassing look for Putin, who, again, as a strong man, relies on his strength. That's why he says people should support him, right? He goes, listen, I'm not subject to law. I don't have to respect human rights or civil liberties or get permission from the courts. I can do anything to anyone. But in exchange, I will keep Russia safe. And when he fails in that duty so epically, then it is a huge humiliation for Putin. And it really hopefully makes some Russians question the value of spending so much of their internal resources on this war, right? So anyway, let's talk about the other bad news for Putin. And that has been a really interesting sort of stalling out of Russian military progress in the region. You can see here that as of 4 p.m. yesterday, right, there's not really any changes to the front line. And when we take it back to the 25th, also not really any changes. When we go back to the 24th, you can see a small Russian advance in Novomykhailivka, a couple of blocks, which actually, as we talked about, I'm sort of surprised that it's been that slow, right? Usually Russian forces are very effective at peeling off block by block once they get into an urban area. So all this to say that the big Russian offensive seems to have really petered out. And given that the Ukrainian forces are still further delayed from receiving Western aid, you really are questioning why Russia is not trying to exploit this relatively short window of advantage. And I think they would if they could. There's been talk that Russia wants to raise 2 new armies come springtime, that their mobilization efforts will enable them to at least get these armies to the field, but it's not clear if there is time or resources to train or equip them with anything resembling modern equipment. Now, obviously, a mediocrely equipped and trained army is still an army. I don't want to fight them. But it's still, I think, indicative of the fact that the prognosticated collapse of Ukrainian forces has really been a little overwrought. And you can see here, right, Russia is still conducting a lot of combat operations, right, outside of Avdiivka, in Bakhmut, right? They're really doing a lot of attacks, and it looks kind of like the attacks we saw maybe 6 or 7 years ago, or 6 or 7 months ago, before Russia really dialed in and quadrupled down on Avdiivka, where they're just sort of pushing across the front line, almost probing anywhere for weakness. It's really bizarre that Russia found a way to execute a strategy well, but then they don't. And that, to me, is one of the strangest parts. Anyway, guys, if you need to find a way to execute on what you want to do in any given day, right? You don't need to raise an army, but you do need to skew the odds in your favor. That's why I made Strike Gum. Strike Gum is 90 milligrams of caffeine, all the caffeine of a Red Bull or an Amp Energy, but 0 sugar and 100 milligrams of alpha GPC for further mental clarity. It is way, way, way better for your budget than buying an energy drink. $4 at the gas station the last time I was there. So you definitely want to check it out, not just at strikegum.com, but on Amazon. And I'm going to link to the Amazon pages in the description. Thanks to everybody that's left us a 5-star review. On Amazon, that is huge. So if you have had a positive experience, please leave us an honest review on Amazon, and be sure to check us out. And of course, a huge thank you to all the members of combatvetnews.com. Hit like and subscribe to the video, and I will see all you guys in the next one. Cheers.